I spent over 8 years secretly paying off a house for my parents and my golden child sister. She took out massive loans to fund her luxury shopping habits. Then my family demanded my new $947,000 home, or they would disown me entirely. So I did the one thing that made them absolutely scream. I became the bank and I foreclosed on them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and tried to steal your success. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia meant keeping up appearances at all costs. But inside our pristine family home, emotional coldness and blatant favoritism permeated every single room. Our house was a fortress of expectations that I could never quite meet. From elementary school through college, I maintained straight A grades, joined honor societies, and eventually built a highly successful independent accounting firm from the ground up. But no matter how hard I worked, I was always second best to my younger sister Talia. Talia was the undeniable golden child. She spent her days curating a fake wealthy lifestyle on social media while acting like the eternal victim whenever real life caught up with her. The story of my ultimate revenge kicks off immediately at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary cookout. It was the middle of July, and the Georgia heat was absolutely unforgiving. The smoke from the grill carried the scent of hickory and sweet barbecue sauce across the manicured backyard. Classic R&B music blasted from the oversized speakers on the stone patio. There were over 50 relatives, friends, and church members gathered around carrying plastic cups and paper plates. At 34 years old, I had just achieved a major life milestone. I had closed on a stunning modern home in the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead. It was a massive accomplishment that I handled entirely on my own, using the profits from my firm. I was standing near the patio edge holding a plate of ribs and enjoying the afternoon when the music suddenly cut off. My mother Vivian stood on the elevated wooden deck holding a crystal champagne flute. She clinked it repeatedly with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of the entire crowd. The lively chatter died down immediately. My father Thomas stood proudly beside her wearing a crisp linen suit even at a backyard barbecue. He was a prominent church elder and projecting a flawless image to the community was everything to him. "Thank you all for being here today," my mother projected her voice over the hushed crowd. 40 years of marriage is a true blessing from God. But today, we have another incredible blessing to celebrate with our community. I took a sip of my sweet tea, completely unaware of the massive trap that was closing around me. Talia stood a few feet away from the deck, linking arms with her husband Preston. Preston was a white man who constantly bragged about being a tech visionary, but he had not held a steady job in 3 years. He carried himself with an insufferable sense of entitlement, always looking down on my hard work while he lived off my parents. My mother beamed and looked directly at me. "As you all know, Talia and Preston are preparing to start a family. And our wonderful, successful daughter Sasha has decided to give them the ultimate gift. Next week, Sasha will be signing over the deed to her newly purchased $947,000 home in Buckhead, so her sister can have the perfect place to raise my future grandchildren." The cold, sweet tea felt like thick ash in my throat. I froze, staring up at my mother in pure shock. The entire backyard erupted into thunderous applause. Aunts, uncles, and prominent church members turned to me, smiling and raising their drinks in my direction. The cheering was deafening. I felt the immense collective weight of 50 pairs of eyes pinning me to the spot. I had never said a single word about giving my house to anyone. I had spent countless months searching for that home, saving every dollar, negotiating the complex contract, and planning my peaceful future there. Now my mother was standing on a deck in front of our entire community, intentionally weaponizing their applause to publicly trap me into surrendering my biggest financial asset. Talia placed a delicate hand over her completely flat stomach and wiped a perfectly timed fake tear from her cheek. She looked right at me and mouthed the words, "Thank you, sister." Preston just stood there with a smug, arrogant grin on his face. He casually shoved his hands into the pockets of his expensive designer pants, looking entirely too comfortable, claiming a home that I had worked my entire adult life to buy. The loud applause began to fade into a murmur of excited chatter. People were actively waiting for me to say something heartwarming. My father motioned heavily with his hands, signaling for me to come up to the deck. The pressure in my chest tightened painfully, but my analytical mind instantly kicked into overdrive. I was a certified public accountant. I dealt with hard facts, cold numbers, and legal documents every single day. I absolutely did not operate on emotional manipulation. I set my paper plate down on a nearby folding table. I took a deep, steady breath and walked straight toward the wooden deck. My mother leaned down, holding the wireless microphone out to me, fully expecting me to play my part in her little performance. She expected me to fold just like I always did when the family demanded a sacrifice. I did not reach for the microphone. Instead, I looked right at my mother, then over at Talia and Preston, and finally out at the expectant crowd. My voice was incredibly steady, and it carried clearly across the quiet yard. I am not sure where this extreme misunderstanding started, I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite but undeniably firm. But I am not giving my home to anyone. That house belongs to me. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and immediate. You could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator coming from inside the open kitchen window. My mother slowly lowered the microphone, her confident smile snapping into a hard, furious line. The warm community atmosphere evaporated in a single second, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating tension. My father stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. I had just publicly embarrassed them, and in our household, that was the absolute ultimate sin. I stood my ground, completely refusing to break eye contact with my mother. The war had officially begun, and I was no longer the compliant financial safety net they thought they could control. My mother stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. In her world, a public declaration like hers was an ironclad contract. You do not contradict the matriarch in front of the congregation. But I was not the same girl who used to hand over her allowance to keep the peace. I stood there, breathing evenly, waiting for the next move. Talia was the first to break the heavy silence. She let out a sharp, trembling gasp that echoed perfectly across the quiet patio. Within seconds, heavy tears were streaming down her flawlessly contoured face. She swayed slightly, leaning heavily against Preston, and placed both hands protectively over her stomach. It was a completely flat stomach, but she rubbed it with the frantic, dramatic energy of a mother protecting her unborn child from imminent danger. "How could you do this to me, Sasha?" she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "You know how high my blood pressure has been lately. The doctor said any sudden stress could be dangerous for the baby." The crowd immediately shifted in her favor. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered guests. Aunt Shirley clutched her chest, murmuring a quiet prayer for the poor, innocent child. My father took a threatening step forward, his face darkening with rage, but before he could speak, Preston took control of the stage. Preston stepped up, placing himself squarely between me and his weeping wife. He was wearing his usual uniform of crisp khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets and tilted his head, looking at me with an expression of profound disappointment. It was the exact patronizing look he used when he tried to explain cryptocurrency to me at family dinners. "Come on, Sasha. Let us be reasonable here," Preston said, his voice smooth and incredibly condescending. He spoke slowly and deliberately, as if he were trying to explain a simple mathematical concept to a particularly stubborn toddler. "You have done well for yourself, and we are all very proud of you. You built a nice little accounting practice and you acquired some capital. But with capital comes responsibility. It is a matter of basic resource allocation and family equity." I stared at him, amazed by his sheer audacity. This unemployed white man, who had been living entirely off my parents for 3 years, was standing in my parents' backyard lecturing me, an African-American woman who had built a successful firm from the ground up, about resource allocation. "You have to look at the bigger picture," Preston continued, shaking his head sadly. Talia is your sister. She is bringing new life into this world. We are trying to build a foundation for our family, and frankly, we need the space more than a single woman living alone. You have to understand the systemic barriers Talia faces. As a woman of color trying to navigate this society, she needs a safe haven. You have the privilege of financial stability right now. It is incredibly selfish to hoard that wealth when your own sister is struggling to establish her family. My jaw physically ached from how hard I was clenching my teeth. He was actually using the language of systemic oppression to justify stealing my house. He was weaponizing the real struggles of Black women to secure a luxury home for himself while contributing absolutely nothing to the equation. He stood there dripping in unearned confidence, playing the role of the enlightened ally while actively trying to strip a Black woman of her hard-earned assets. The worst part was that my parents were nodding along with him. My father looked at Preston with profound respect. Preston was the son-in-law my father had always wanted, a confident white man who used big words and projected an aura of absolute authority. It did not matter that Preston had failed at 3 different startup ventures, or that his current company existed only as a sleek website with 0 revenue. To my parents, Preston was an intellectual, a visionary who just needed the right backing. It is about generational wealth, Sasha Preston lectured, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. You have to understand how wealth building works. If you transfer the property to us, we can leverage that asset to secure more funding for my tech startup. Once my company goes public, we will all benefit. A rising tide lifts all boats. By holding on to this house, you are actually stifling the financial growth of the entire family. It is frankly a very narrow-minded way to look at economics. I listened to this man explain basic economics to a certified public accountant. He wanted me to hand over $1 million asset so he could use it as collateral for a non-existent technology company. And my parents were staring at him like he was delivering a brilliant sermon. Sasha, please, Talia sobbed, peeking out from behind Preston's shoulder. We already picked out the nursery colors. We thought you loved us. We thought you cared about your niece or nephew. We told the interior designer we would be moving in next month. You told an interior designer you were moving into a house you do not own, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. We were operating on the understanding that this family takes care of its own. Preston interrupted, taking another step toward me. He pulled one hand from his pocket and pointed a finger at me. You know, Sasha, I read an interesting article recently about the toxic effects of hyper-individualism in modern society. People get a little bit of money and suddenly they forget their roots. They forget the community that raised them. Your parents gave you everything. They provided the foundation for your success. Asking you to share the fruits of that success with your pregnant sister is not a huge ask. It is your basic family duty. The guests were openly glaring at me now. Some were shaking their heads in disgust. Aunt Shirley muttered something to the woman next to her about how education changes people for the worse. I was the villain in their eyes, the greedy corporate sister who refused to give up one of her many toys to help a struggling young family. My mother crossed her arms over her chest, offering me a look of pure disdain. You are embarrassing us, Sasha, my mother said sharply. You are making a scene over bricks and mortar when your sister is carrying the next generation of this family. I raised you to be a good Christian woman who shares her blessings. I did not raise a selfish miser. They did not know the truth. They did not know about the late nights, the panic attacks, the years of grinding work, and they certainly did not know the reality of my parents' financial situation or the massive secret I had been keeping for the past 8 years to protect the very people who were currently trying to publicly execute my character. My father took another step toward me, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pure rage. He pointed a heavy finger at my chest, his voice booming with the authority he usually reserved for his Sunday morning sermons. You are a completely ungrateful child, Sasha, he bellowed across the patio. We gave you a roof over your head, we fed you, we paid for your education, and we supported your dreams. And now, when your own flesh and blood needs a roof over her head to raise a child, You stand here and humiliate us in front of our friends and our entire congregation. You are hoarding your wealth like a greedy sinner, and you should be ashamed of yourself. I looked at the man who had always demanded absolute perfection from me. He was standing there passionately defending the daughter who had dropped out of college twice, and the son-in-law who refused to work a standard 9-to-5 job. I had spent my entire life trying to earn his approval, and in a matter of minutes he was willing to throw me to the wolves just to maintain the grand illusion of his perfect family. The sheer injustice of it made my blood run cold. I turned away from him without saying a single word and walked over to the patio chair where I had set down my large leather tote bag. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but my mind was completely clear and focused. I reached inside the bag and pulled out my thick black financial planner. It was the master ledger where I kept track of all my personal and business accounts. I walked back to the center of the wooden deck and slammed the heavy book down onto the glass-top patio table. The loud thud made several guests physically jump in their seats. "A roof over my head," I asked, my voice echoing in the dead silent yard. "You want to talk about providing a roof over my head, Dad? Let us talk about the roof over your head right now." I looked directly at my mother, who was staring at the black book as if it were a live grenade. "For the past 8 years, I have been the one providing the roof over your heads." A collective gasp rose from the 50 guests gathered in the yard. My father looked genuinely confused, dropping his pointing finger. "What absolute nonsense are you talking about?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "I paid this house off years ago." "No, Dad, you absolutely did not," I said, feeling the heavy years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. 8 years ago, Mom came to my apartment, crying perfectly real tears because the bank was threatening to take this house. You had taken out a massive second mortgage to pay for Talia to go to that expensive private design school out of state, the school she dropped out of after just one single semester. You were completely underwater and about to lose everything. So I stepped in. Every single month for the past 96 months, I have quietly transferred $3,000 to the bank to cover your mortgage. I did it so you would not lose your respected position at the church. I did it so your precious Talia could keep living in her comfortable childhood bedroom without ever worrying about the bills. I have literally bled myself dry to keep this family afloat while building my firm, and you have the nerve to stand here and call me ungrateful. I opened the black planner and flipped to the heavily tabbed section marked Family Expenses. I pushed the open book across the glass table directly toward my father. "Read it." I challenged him, keeping my eyes locked on his. "Read the bank confirmation numbers. Look at the routing details and the date stamps. Over $288,000 of my hard-earned money has gone directly into keeping you in this house. And you want me to hand over my brand new home to the very sister who caused your massive debt in the first place." My father stared down at the open pages, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his eyes scanned the neat columns of numbers. My mother covered her mouth with her trembling hand, her eyes wide with absolute panic. She had obviously never told him the full dark extent of their financial ruin or the fact that I had been their secret savior all these years. Talia shrank back against Preston, looking nervously at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Preston, realizing that his carefully constructed narrative was rapidly slipping away, puffed out his chest and stepped forward again. He was visibly sweating now, his confident tech visionary facade cracking under the crushing weight of hard financial evidence. He slammed his hand down on the table, right next to my open planner. "Oh, please, Sasha." Preston scoffed, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice pitched up nervously, revealing his panic. "You act like you are some kind of noble martyr, so what if you helped them out a little bit in the past? That is exactly what family does when they have extra capital. But you are completely missing the point. Your little monthly payments do not even matter anymore. What good are your stupid mortgage payments when the house got a foreclosure notice last week anyway?" The instant the furious words left his mouth, Preston froze completely solid. His pale eyes widened in absolute horror as his own brain caught up with what he had just admitted loudly in front of 50 people. Talia gasped sharply and grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging fiercely into his light blue shirt. The silence that followed was entirely different from the ones before. This was a heavy, suffocating silence, born of pure, unadulterated shock. I stared at him, my analytical mind struggling to process the information he had just screamed. A foreclosure notice. That was completely impossible. I had personally authorized the $3,000 transfer on the first of the month, just like I always did. The mortgage was completely current, and the account was in good standing. My father slowly turned his head away from the ledger to look directly at Preston. The proud church elder looked as if the solid ground had just crumbled completely beneath his feet. "What did you just say?" My father whispered, his voice completely drained of its former booming authority. "What foreclosure notice, Preston? What exactly are you talking about?" My mother looked completely terrified now. She darted her panicked eyes between Talia and Preston, her hands shaking violently at her sides. Preston swallowed hard, his face turning a blotchy, uneven red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just looked down at Talia, who was now staring at the wooden deck looking like a trapped animal surrounded by predators. My mind raced frantically, putting the devastating pieces together. If my payments had been going through faithfully, and the house was currently in foreclosure, that meant someone had recently taken out another massive loan against the property. And based on the sheer, undisguised panic on the faces of Preston and Talia, they were the ones who had done it. I looked at the golden sister who was supposedly carrying a child, and the arrogant white brother-in-law who had just confidently lectured me about building generational wealth. They had not just bled my parents dry for years. They had secretly stolen the very house I had been quietly paying for. And now they were trying to steal my new home to cover up their massive financial crimes. The rest of the weekend was a blur of unanswered phone calls and frantic text messages. My parents tried calling me dozens of times, alternating between angry demands for an explanation and desperate pleas for me to just come over and talk. I ignored all of them. I needed hard facts, not emotional manipulation. By 7 o'clock Monday morning, I was already sitting at my large mahogany desk in my downtown accounting firm. The office was completely silent, the kind of deep quiet that allowed me to focus entirely on the numbers. I poured myself a strong cup of black coffee, turned on my dual monitors, and got straight to work. As a certified public accountant, I had access to a variety of financial databases and public county records that the average person rarely knows how to navigate. I logged into the secure portal for the county property appraiser and typed in my parents' home address. My fingers flew across the keyboard, driven by a cold, hard determination to uncover exactly what Preston and Talia had done. The search results loaded instantly, and I clicked on the detailed property history tab. I scrolled down to the mortgage section, fully expecting to see the clean, clear title that I had diligently paid off over the last 8 years. Instead, the screen displayed a complicated web of recent financial transactions that made my stomach drop. There it was, plain as day, recorded just 14 months ago. A massive home equity line of credit, or HELOC, had been taken out against my parents' property. The total approved line of credit was for $600,000. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the harsh digital numbers. A HELOC allows homeowners to borrow against the equity they have built up in their property, essentially using their home as a giant credit card. Because I had spent 8 years aggressively paying down their primary mortgage, the house had accumulated a tremendous amount of free and clear equity. Someone had realized this and used my hard work as their own personal piggy bank. I clicked deeper into the county registry, pulling up the publicly filed lien documents. The terms of the loan were absolutely brutal. It was an adjustable rate mortgage with interest-only payments required for the first 2 years. I quickly checked the payment history status. The line of credit had been completely maxed out. Every single dollar of that $600,000 had been drained from the account. And worse, the status indicator was flashing a stark warning. The account was severely delinquent. No interest payments had been made in over 6 months. That explained the foreclosure notice Preston had accidentally mentioned at the barbecue. When you stop paying a home equity loan, the bank has the absolute legal right to seize the property to recover their funds. My parents were completely underwater again, but this time the debt was catastrophic. I printed the documents, the printer whirring loudly in the quiet office as it spat out page after page of financial ruin. I arranged the papers neatly on my desk, highlighting the key figures with a bright yellow marker. My mind raced, analyzing the timeline. 14 months ago was exactly when Preston had proudly announced the launch of his new disruptive technology startup. It was also the exact same time Talia had started flaunting a sudden influx of designer bags and luxury vacations on her social media accounts, claiming she was a successful lifestyle influencer. They had not built a business or earned a sudden windfall. They had secretly leveraged my parents' home, draining the equity I had paid for to fund their fake millionaire lifestyle. And when the money ran out and the bank came calling, they panicked. Their brilliant solution was to manipulate my parents into forcing me to give up my newly purchased Buckhead home so they would have a luxurious place to live when my parents inevitably lost theirs. The sheer calculated evil of their plan was breathtaking. I picked up my coffee mug, my hands surprisingly steady. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the crushing disappointment I usually felt when my family let me down. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. For years I had played the role of the dutiful daughter, the reliable safety net, who always stepped in to fix their mistakes while accepting their constant criticism. I had let them gaslight me into believing I was the selfish one, while they quietly stole my financial security. I looked at the highlighted $600,000 figure on the page. Preston thought he was a financial genius. He thought he could use big words and fake confidence to intimidate me into handing over $1 million asset. He severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I knew exactly how capital worked. I knew how debt worked. And most importantly, I knew how to use the law to absolutely destroy someone who tried to commit financial fraud against my family. I opened a new tab on my browser and logged into my business banking portal. I checked the available liquid capital in my firm investment accounts. It was a substantial amount carefully accumulated through years of smart investments and relentless hard work. I was not going to give them my house. I was going to give them a harsh lesson in basic economics. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line for my corporate real estate attorney. It was time to start setting the trap. I had barely finished outlining my legal strategy with my attorney when the heavy glass door of my office swung open. I looked up from my notepad expecting to see my receptionist, but instead my parents barged right into my private workspace. They had not called ahead, and they certainly did not have an appointment. They looked completely disheveled, which was incredibly rare for them. My father was not wearing his usual tailored suit jacket, and my mother was clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. I placed the phone back onto its receiver and folded my hands on the mahogany desk, waiting for them to speak. I noticed immediately that Talia and Preston were nowhere to be found. They had sent my parents to do their dirty work just like they always did. My mother Vivian marched straight up to my desk and planted her hands firmly on the polished wood. She did not look apologetic or ashamed. Instead, her face was twisted into an expression of righteous anger. She was actually mad at me. "How could you just walk away from us like that yesterday, Sasha?" she demanded, her voice shrill and accusatory. "You caused an absolute scene in front of the entire congregation. Your father had to spend the rest of the evening doing damage control with the church elders. You humiliated us." I stared at her, completely amazed by her profound delusion. "I humiliated you?" I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and even. "Mom, I just found out yesterday that the house I have been quietly paying off for 8 straight years is currently in foreclosure. I found out because your son-in-law accidentally shouted it in front of 50 people. And you are standing in my office right now, upset about your public image." My father Thomas stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim his usual booming authority. "Now you listen to me, Sasha," he said, pointing a finger at me. "We are dealing with a minor financial setback right now, but that does not give you the right to disrespect your mother. What happened with the house is just a temporary situation. It is a family investment." "A family investment," I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the words hang in the quiet office. I pulled the printed county records from the edge of my desk and slid the pages toward them. You took out a $600,000 home equity line of credit. You drained the entire account. You have not made a single interest payment in over 6 months, and the bank is actively preparing to seize the property. That is not an investment, Dad. That is financial suicide. My mother aggressively pushed the papers back toward me, refusing to even look at the numbers. You do not understand how these things work, Sasha, she snapped, rolling her eyes. You are just an accountant. You sit at a desk all day crunching other people's numbers. Preston is an entrepreneur. He has a brilliant mind for technology. He just needed a little bit of seed capital to get his new software company off the ground. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as the ugly truth of their favoritism stood naked right in front of me. They knew. They knew exactly what Preston and Talia had done, and they were actively defending them. Let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward slightly. You gave Preston $600,000 of the equity that I built for you. You let him drain the entire value of your home for a non-existent startup company. It is not non-existent, my father interrupted defensively. Preston is holding meetings with major venture capitalists next month. His platform is going to revolutionize the digital market. He explained the whole business model to us, and it is incredibly sophisticated. Once the company goes public, we will get our money back tenfold. He promised us a massive return on our investment. You just lack his broader financial vision. The blatant racism and ingrained self-hatred in my parents' logic was absolutely staggering. They were so desperate to have a successful white son-in-law that they blindly trusted a man who had never held a real job. They worshipped his whiteness and his empty corporate buzzwords. They believed his vague promises of future wealth over the proven, tangible financial support of their own black daughter. They literally handed him the keys to their financial survival because he wore a nice suit and spoke with unearned confidence. If Preston is such a brilliant visionary, why is the bank foreclosing on your house? I asked calmly. If his company is so successful, why has he not made a single payment in 6 months? My mother waved her hand dismissively, ignoring my logical questions. Startups take time to generate liquid cash, Sasha, she said, repeating the exact phrases Preston had undoubtedly fed to her. We just hit a minor cash flow problem, and that is exactly why we are here today. We are a family, and families help each other during temporary rough patches. I sat back in my leather chair, crossing my arms. And exactly how do you expect me to help you this time, I asked, even though I already knew the sickening answer. My father cleared his throat, avoiding my direct gaze. You need to sell that massive new house you just bought in Buckhead, he stated plainly, as if he were asking me to pick up a gallon of milk from the grocery store. You are a single woman, Sasha. You do not need $1 million property all to yourself. It is incredibly selfish to live in luxury while your parents are facing eviction. If you sell the Buckhead house and give us the cash, we can pay off the bank loan and save our family home. Then you can just rent a nice little apartment downtown for yourself. My mother nodded enthusiastically, chiming in to support his insane demand. Yes, and once Preston gets his funding, he will pay you back with interest, she added brightly. Plus, Talia is expecting a baby soon. We cannot have her dealing with the stress of a foreclosure. She needs a stable environment. It is your duty as the older sister to step up and make this sacrifice for the good of the family name. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. They were completely serious. They honestly expected me to liquidate my greatest professional achievement, my beautiful new home that I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears, just to cover the debts of a manipulative sister and a parasitic brother-in-law. They would rather strip me of everything I owned than admit that their golden child had ruined them. They would rather make me homeless than lose the prestige of parading Preston around at their church events. I let the silence stretch out, letting their toxic demands echo off the walls of my successful firm, the firm they never supported, the firm they called a cute little accounting practice. I am not selling my house, I said, my voice quiet but laced with absolute steel, and I am not giving you a single dime to cover Preston's fraud. My mother's face contorted with vicious anger. You ungrateful little brat, she hissed, leaning over my desk. We are going to lose our home. We are going to be thrown out onto the street, and it will be entirely your fault. No, Mom, I replied, staring right into her furious eyes. It will be Preston's fault, and Talia's fault, and your fault for letting them use you. I am done being your safety net. You made your investment. Now you can deal with the returns. I suggest you leave my office before I have security escort you out. They stood there in stunned silence, realizing for the very first time that the well had finally run dry. The obedient daughter was dead. I watched them turn around and storm out of my office, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind them. The war had escalated, and I knew the smear campaign was about to begin. My parents leaving my office did not mean the end of the battle. In fact, it only marked the beginning of a much darker chapter. Barely an hour after they stormed out, a notification popped up on my computer screen. It was an email from Preston with the subject line marked "Urgent Legal Matter." I opened it and immediately scoffed at the ridiculous corporate jargon he used to try and sound intimidating. Sasha, the email began. Your behavior this morning toward your parents was completely unacceptable. You are actively trying to sabotage a highly lucrative family investment out of pure jealousy. If you continue to spread lies about my technology company or refuse to transfer the deed to your property by the end of the week, I will have no choice but to retain legal counsel. I will sue you for defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We have the full backing of your parents. Do not test me. I did not even bother replying. His threat of a defamation lawsuit was absolutely laughable, considering truth is an absolute defense against defamation, and I had the county records to prove every single word I said. But his desperate, aggressive tone confirmed what I already suspected. They were completely out of options and running out of time. They needed my house to secure their own future before the bank came to take my parents' house. I minimized his empty threat and went back to the digital files I had pulled from the county records. The massive $600,000 loan was still sitting heavily on my screen. Something about the transaction was still bothering my analytical mind. My parents were gullible and overly trusting when it came to Preston, but they were also incredibly protective of their public image. Taking out a massive loan against their primary residence was a huge risk even for them. And doing it without consulting me, their free personal accountant, was highly suspicious. I opened the downloaded PDF copy of the original home equity line of credit application. The bank had scanned the final signed documents into the public registry. I scrolled through the standard terms and conditions, the adjustable rate clauses, and the repayment schedules until I reached the final page, the signature page. There at the bottom were the scrawled signatures of Thomas and Vivian. I leaned in closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I scrutinized the blue ink. As an accountant, I dealt with my parents' tax returns and legal documents every single year. I knew their signatures as well as I knew my own. My father's signature was usually bold and sweeping, full of confidence. My mother's was tight and perfectly cursive, a leftover habit from her days taking penmanship classes. The signatures on this bank document looked incredibly wrong. The letters were shaky and uneven, lacking the natural fluid motion of someone signing their own name. The T in my father's name was crossed too low, and the V in my mother's name was entirely the wrong shape. It looked exactly like someone had tried to slowly trace their names from another document. I quickly pulled up a copy of their most recent tax return from my secure client files and displayed it side by side with the bank document. The difference was glaringly obvious. To the untrained eye of an overworked bank clerk processing dozens of loans a day, it might pass. But to an auditor trained to spot financial discrepancies, it was a neon sign pointing straight to fraud. I zoomed in further, increasing the magnification on the PDF to 400%. I stared at the pixelated loops and lines, my heart beginning to pound a heavy rhythm against my ribs. The pressure applied to the pen was completely inconsistent, stopping and starting in unnatural places. This was not a sloppy signature. This was a deliberate, calculated forgery. My mind raced back to the day of the barbecue. I thought about Talia's perfectly timed tears and her desperate act of clutching her flat stomach. I thought about how she had refused to make eye contact with anyone when I confronted them about the foreclosure. She had looked like a trapped animal. And now I knew exactly why. Talia had forged our parents' signatures. She and Preston had somehow managed to get the loan approved and the funds transferred without my parents ever setting foot inside a bank. They had stolen $600,000 by committing federal wire fraud and identity theft against their own family. The pieces all locked into place, forming a horrifying picture of utter betrayal. My parents actually believed the loan was a legitimate family investment because Preston had likely convinced them to sign some vague preliminary paperwork, and then Talia had forged their names on the final binding documents. They had no idea they had personally guaranteed a $600,000 debt that was now in default. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the office pressing in around me. The level of deception was beyond anything I had imagined. They had not just manipulated our parents, they had actively committed a major felony. And now, to cover their tracks, they were trying to steal my home and make me the villain of the family. I looked at Preston's threatening email still open on my other monitor. He wanted to play legal games. He wanted to threaten me with lawsuits. He had absolutely no idea what he had just unleashed. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for my attorney again. We needed to change our strategy. We were no longer just dealing with a simple real estate dispute. We were dealing with federal financial crimes, and I was going to make sure they faced every single consequence. The retaliation came exactly as I expected, but the sheer speed and viciousness of it still managed to surprise me. By Tuesday morning, my phone was constantly buzzing with notifications. Friends, colleagues, and distant relatives were all sending me links to the same video. I opened Instagram, and there was Talia live broadcasting her manufactured misery to her 10,000 followers. She was sitting on the expensive velvet sofa in my parents' living room, the very house she had secretly drained of all its equity. She looked perfectly disheveled, wearing an oversized beige sweater and practically no makeup, a stark departure from her usual glamorous posts. The camera angle was carefully chosen to highlight the subtle fake rounding of her stomach. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, her voice trembling with expertly crafted emotion. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she sniffled, looking directly into the lens with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I always believed that family was supposed to protect each other. But sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. My sister Sasha is a very successful accountant. She just bought $1 million home in Buckhead. And yesterday she looked me right in the eye while I'm carrying her future niece or nephew and told me she would rather see me homeless than help our family out of a temporary financial crisis." She paused, taking a deep, ragged breath, dabbing at her dry eyes with the tissue. "We just needed a little bit of support while Preston's tech company gets off the ground. He works so hard, you guys. He is trying to build something amazing for our future. But Sasha is so consumed by her own wealth and her own greed that she is willing to let our parents lose their home and throw a pregnant woman out onto the street. I am just so heartbroken. I do not even know who my sister is anymore." The comments section was an absolute dumpster fire of outrage and sympathy. People were calling me a monster, a greedy corporate sellout, and a disgrace to the Black community. They praised Talia for her bravery and sent prayers for her fake unborn baby. She was successfully manipulating thousands of strangers into hating a woman they had never even met, all while actively committing massive financial fraud. And she was not acting alone. My father, a deeply respected elder at our large local church, was actively running a parallel smear campaign in the real world. By Wednesday afternoon, several prominent church members had called my office, leaving incredibly aggressive voicemails. They demanded that I repent for my selfishness and honor my parents by sacrificing my material wealth for the good of the family. My father had apparently stood up during the Wednesday evening prayer service and practically given a sermon about the evils of modern materialism and how the love of money was destroying his family from the inside out. He painted himself as a devoted patriarch, struggling to keep his family together, while his wealthy, heartless daughter refused to lend a helping hand. The social pressure was immense. It was the exact same tactic they had used at the barbecue, attempting to weaponize public opinion to force my compliance. They expected me to crack. They expected me to issue a tearful public apology sign over the deed to my house and quietly accept my role as the family scapegoat just to make the public humiliation stop. They were completely wrong. I did not engage. I did not post a furious rebuttal on social media. I did not call the church elders to defend myself. I maintained absolute radio silence. Every time Talia posted a new crying video or a passive-aggressive quote about toxic family members, I simply screen recorded it and saved it to a secure external hard drive. I compiled every single comment, every message, and every recorded voicemail. I was building an airtight legal file. While they were busy performing for their respective audiences, I was meeting with my attorney and the federal investigators. I showed them the forged signatures on the loan documents. I provided my personal ledgers, proving my history of mortgage payments. And I handed over Talia's videos where she publicly admitted to utilizing the loan money to fund Preston's non-existent company. She was literally documenting her own crimes for the entire internet to see. Sitting in my quiet office watching her fake tears on my monitor, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The little girl who used to desperately seek her parents' approval was completely gone. The woman who had quietly paid their mortgage for 8 years to protect their precious reputation was dead. In their place was a highly trained financial auditor who was systematically dismantling the lives of the people trying to destroy her. Let them talk, I thought to myself, saving another one of Talia's videos to the drive. Let them preach. They were just tightening the noose around their own necks. The next morning, my receptionist buzzed my desk, her voice uncharacteristically tense. She said there was a man in the waiting area demanding to see me immediately. Before I could even ask for a name, my heavy office door swung open, and Preston confidently strolled in. He was not wearing his usual casual khaki pants today. Instead, he was dressed in an incredibly sharp, tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first car. He looked every bit the successful corporate executive, an image he was entirely funding with my parents' stolen equity. He did not wait for an invitation. He walked straight over to one of my leather guest chairs and dropped into it, crossing his legs with an air of absolute ownership. He looked around my office, examining the framed degrees and awards on my wall, with a condescending little smirk. "Nice place you have here, Sasha," he said, resting his hands on his lap. "But it is a little rigid, do you not think? A little too old school. My new office space in Midtown has an open floor plan. It fosters better creative synergy." I did not take the bait. I simply leaned back in my chair, keeping my face completely neutral. "What do you want, Preston?" I asked, cutting straight through his pathetic attempt at small talk. He sighed heavily, acting as if my directness was a personal burden he had to patiently endure. "I am here to offer you an olive branch, Sasha. The family is being torn apart, and frankly, it is entirely unnecessary. Your parents are incredibly stressed, Talia is crying every single day, and the church community is turning against you. But I am a reasonable man. I know how to find solutions that benefit everyone." I slowly reached my right hand under the edge of my heavy wooden desk, where I kept a small digital recording device for documenting complex client meetings. With a completely steady motion, I clicked the record button on. The tiny red light flared to life, hidden safely in the shadows. A solution, I repeated, keeping my voice soft and encouraging. "I am listening." Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, suddenly dropping the casual act, and switching into what he clearly believed was a high-powered negotiation mode. He looked me right in the eye. "I am willing to offer you a 5% equity stake in my new technology company." I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his offer hang in the quiet room. 5%, I said. "Exactly," he replied, nodding confidently. 5% of a company that is going to revolutionize digital market analysis. When we hit our Series A funding round next year, that 5% will easily be worth $2 or $3 million. You are an accountant, Sasha. You know a good return on investment when you see one. And what exactly are you asking for in exchange for this incredibly generous 5% stake? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. He smiled a thin, predatory smile. "Just the deed to the Buckhead house. You transfer the property to Talia and me, and we will execute the equity contract immediately. It is a win-win situation. You get to be part of a massive corporate success story, and we get the space we need for our growing family. Plus, your parents get to keep their home because I will finally have the collateral I need to secure my next round of funding. I had to actively bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing right in his face. He was offering me a worthless piece of paper for a tangible $1 million asset. It was the absolute height of white privilege and unearned audacity. He truly believed he could walk into my professional space and swindle me with corporate buzzwords. That is quite the offer, Preston, I said, keeping my voice smooth. But there is one thing I just do not understand. If your company is so incredibly successful and you have all this massive potential for growth, why have you not paid a single dime toward the interest on the $600,000 loan you took out against my parents' house? Preston's confident smile vanished instantly. His eyes narrowed and he shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair. How do you know about the exact loan amount? He demanded. I am a certified public accountant, Preston. I reminded him, resting my hands on my desk. I know how to read public county records. I saw the home equity line of credit. I saw the $600,000 balance. And I saw that the account is currently in default because the interest payments have not been made in 6 months. He waved his hand dismissively, trying to recover his arrogant composure. That is just a temporary cash flow issue, he said quickly. Startups burn through capital rapidly in the early stages. We had to invest heavily in development marketing and securing top-tier talent. You cannot build an empire without aggressive spending. I am managing a massive budget, Sasha. You cannot expect me to worry about a few missed interest payments when I am dealing with high-level venture capitalists. So you admit that you are the one controlling the $600,000, I asked, leaning in slightly, guiding him right into the trap. You are the one who decided how that specific loan money was spent. Of course I am controlling the funds, he scoffed, acting completely offended that I would even question his authority. Your parents gave me full financial discretion. They know I have the vision to turn that seed money into a massive fortune. Talia and I are managing the accounts together. We needed that capital to build our brand. You have to spend money to make money. I let out a slow, steady breath, the tiny recorder under my desk capturing every single arrogant word. He had just explicitly admitted on tape that he and Talia were jointly controlling the stolen funds. He had just confessed to blowing $600,000 of my parents' equity on his fake business and their luxury lifestyle. I see, I said, reaching under the desk and clicking the recorder off. Well, Preston, your offer is certainly something to think about. He stood up aggressively, straightening his expensive suit jacket, a smug look of victory returning to his pale face. He thought he had successfully intimidated me. He thought his ridiculous business pitch had actually worked. Do not think too long, Sasha, he warned, pointing a finger at me. I have venture capitalists waiting. The 5% offer expires on Friday. If you do not sign the house over by then, I am pulling the deal entirely and moving forward with the defamation lawsuit. Have your lawyer draft the deed transfer. I will be sure to have all the necessary paperwork ready by Friday, I replied, looking him dead in the eye. Preston turned on his heel and confidently strutted out of my office, the glass door swinging shut behind him. I sat alone in the quiet room, the heavy digital recorder resting safely in my hand. He thought Friday was going to be the day he finally broke me. He had absolutely no idea that Friday was the day I was going to utterly destroy him. The clock was ticking rapidly toward Friday, but the inevitable consequences of my family financial crimes arrived even sooner than I anticipated. It was Thursday evening, and the heavy, humid Georgia air hung thick over the city. I was standing in the large chef kitchen of my Buckhead home, pouring a glass of Cabernet, when my phone vibrated loudly on the Marble Island. It was a text message from a neighbor who still lived on the same street as my parents. The message contained no words, just a single grainy photograph taken from across the street. I zoomed in on the image. There, taped securely to the heavy oak front door of my childhood home, was a bright neon orange document. It was the official notice of foreclosure and public auction served by the county sheriff department. The bank had finally run out of patience. The 6 months of unpaid interest had triggered the final legal eviction process. The house was no longer theirs. I took a slow sip of my wine, the rich dark liquid warming my throat. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no regret. They had dug this massive grave themselves with their own bare hands, and now they were being forced to lie in it. I set my phone down and walked into my spacious living room, completely prepared to enjoy a quiet, peaceful evening away from their toxic drama. But my peace was violently interrupted just 3 hours later. It was nearly midnight when the harsh, glaring headlights of my father's sedan swept across my front windows, followed immediately by the frantic pounding on my heavy wooden front door. The loud, desperate knocking echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I walked to the front foyer and checked the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. The high-definition night vision showed my parents standing on my manicured front porch. They looked absolutely frantic. My father was still wearing his pajamas, hastily covered by a long trench coat. My mother was clutching her chest, sobbing hysterically, her face completely twisted in pure raw panic. "Sasha, please open the door!" My father yelled, his booming voice cracking with desperation. "Sasha, we know you are in there. Please, you have to help us." I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy door open, standing firmly on the threshold. I did not invite them inside. I just stood there, illuminated by the warm yellow glow of the porch light, looking down at the two people who had spent the last week actively trying to destroy my life and my reputation. The instant the door opened, my mother completely collapsed onto the hard concrete porch. She fell to her knees, her hands reaching out to grab the hem of my silk robe. She was wailing loudly, the sound sharp and grating in the quiet suburban night. "They are taking the house, Sasha!" She sobbed, her makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. The sheriff came. They put a bright orange tag right on the front door. Everyone on the street saw it. The whole church is going to know. "You cannot let them do this to us. You cannot let us become homeless." My father sank to his knees right beside her, his broad shoulders shaking with heavy sobs. I had never seen this man cry in my entire life. He had always been the towering figure of absolute authority, the proud patriarch who demanded perfection and obedience. Now he was kneeling on my welcome mat, begging the daughter he had publicly humiliated just a few days ago. "Please, Sasha," my father pleaded, looking up at me with terrified, bloodshot eyes. "We made a mistake. We trusted the wrong person. Preston lied to us. He said the company was doing great. He said the loan was just a formality. We did not know he was not paying the bank. You have to save us. You are the only one who can fix this. Just sell this house and pay off the loan. We will pay you back every single penny, I swear to God we will." They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Anyone driving by would see two heartbroken, desperate parents begging their cruel, wealthy daughter for mercy. They were playing the ultimate guilt trip, utilizing the sheer shock of seeing them physically kneel to try and break my resolve. They expected me to crumble. They expected the dutiful, obedient daughter to resurface, rushing to comfort them and promising to fix their massive $600,000 mistake. I looked down at them, my expression completely unchanged. My eyes were ice cold, analyzing the situation with the detached logic of an auditor examining a ruined balance sheet. I did not see two loving parents in need. I saw two weak, manipulative people who had actively chosen a white con artist over their own black daughter. They were not crying because they regretted betraying me. They were crying because they got caught and they were terrified of losing their precious social status. "Where are Preston and Talia?" I asked. My voice quiet and perfectly calm, cutting sharply through their loud, hysterical sobbing. My mother sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. "They are not answering their phones," she wailed. "We tried calling them a dozen times. They completely disappeared. But they are just scared, Sasha. They did not mean for this to happen. You cannot punish us for their mistakes." "They forged your signatures on federal loan documents," I reminded them, keeping my tone completely flat. "They stole $600,000 of the equity that I personally paid for. And when the money ran out, you came to my office and demanded that I make myself homeless to cover their theft. You went to your church and called me a greedy sinner. You let Talia go on the internet and drag my name through the mud. You chose them. We are your family, my father cried, reaching out to grab my hand. I easily stepped back out of his desperate reach. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood. I looked at the bright full moon hanging high over the silent neighborhood. The air felt incredibly clear. The suffocating emotional chains that had bound me to these people for 34 years finally snapped, completely breaking away and leaving me feeling lighter than I ever had in my life. I looked back down at the two pathetic figures kneeling on my porch. They thought I was going to save them. They thought my silence meant I was finally giving in to the pressure. I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs. The game was finally over, and it was time to move the pieces into their final positions. I stood there looking down at my parents as they continued their pathetic performance. The sheer entitlement radiating from them was practically suffocating. They actually believed that their tears could wash away the massive federal crimes they had committed, alongside their precious golden child and his white savior husband. They believed they could manipulate me into sacrificing everything I had worked for just to save their fragile public image. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing the uncomfortable reality of the situation to slowly settle over them. My mother finally stopped her hysterical sobbing, looking up at me with tear-streaked makeup and desperate, hopeful eyes. My father stayed on his knees, his hands gripping the edge of my silk robe. I let out a long, slow sigh, ensuring it sounded incredibly defeated and exhausted. I let my shoulders slump slightly, adopting the posture of a woman who had finally been broken by the relentless pressure of her toxic family. Fine, I said, my voice quiet and seemingly resigned. I will do it. The immediate transformation in their demeanor was absolutely sickening to witness. The panicked tears stopped instantly. The desperate pleading vanished completely. My mother practically jumped to her feet, her face breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, acting as if she had not just been sobbing hysterically on the concrete porch a few seconds ago. Oh, thank God, she gasped, reaching out to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped back out of her reach. I knew you would do the right thing, Sasha. I knew you would not abandon your family when we needed you the most. Preston was right about you. He said you just needed a little time to see the bigger picture. Preston said that, did he? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Yes, my father said, standing up and dusting off the knees of his pajama pants. His booming, authoritative voice instantly returned, replacing the desperate pleading from just moments ago. He brushed past the uncomfortable reality of his own public humiliation, eager to reclaim his position of power. We are all going to get through this together, Sasha. You are making a noble sacrifice for your sister and her future child. God will surely bless you for this. I stared at him, feeling a cold, sharp disgust twist in my stomach. They were not even pretending to be grateful. They were already spinning the narrative back into their favor, transforming my supposed surrender into a righteous family victory orchestrated by Preston. Tell Preston to draft the deed transfer documents, I said, ensuring my voice conveyed the perfect mix of defeat and resignation. Tell him to have everything completely ready by Friday morning. We will meet at the downtown notary office at 10 o'clock. And tell him he better make sure the equity contract for his startup is ready to sign at the exact same time. Of course, my father nodded eagerly, clapping his hands together. I will call him right now. He will be thrilled to hear that you have finally come to your senses. Thank you, Sasha. We will see you on Friday. They turned around and practically skipped back to their sedan, completely ignoring the neon orange foreclosure notice that was still taped to their own front door. They were already focused on their bright new future in my $1,000,000 home. I watched their car pull out of my driveway, the red taillights disappearing into the dark suburban night. I closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt, the sharp click echoing loudly in the quiet foyer. I leaned against the cool wood, letting the tense, rigid posture fall away. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the quiet, obedient sister into handing over her entire life savings. They probably thought I was sitting inside my house right now, crying over the loss of my home and agonizing over my future in some small rented apartment. I walked back into my spacious kitchen, picked up my glass of Cabernet, and took a deep, satisfying sip. They were about to have the absolute best 3 days of their lives. I could already imagine the frantic celebratory phone calls my mother was making to Talia. I could easily picture Preston strutting around his fake office bragging to his imaginary venture capitalists about how he had successfully swindled his accountant sister-in-law out of $1 million property. They were going to celebrate their victory completely unaware that I had just handed them the rope they were going to use to hang themselves. The fake surrender was complete. The trap was officially set and the bait had been taken. Friday was not going to be a transfer of property. Friday was going to be an execution. I did not sleep at all that night. My mind was completely buzzing with energy, calculating the final devastating moves of my plan. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already dressed in my sharpest black suit and driving straight toward the financial district of downtown Atlanta. I was not going to the notary office, and I was certainly not drafting any property transfer documents. I was going to a private, secure conference room on the 20th floor of a major commercial bank building. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled room precisely at 7 a.m. There were 3 people already waiting for me sitting around the large, polished conference table. This was the alliance I had been secretly assembling all week, while my family thought I was slowly breaking under their pressure. Sitting at the head of the table was Marcus, a brilliant, aggressive real estate attorney who specialized in complex commercial litigation. To his right sat a woman named Elena, a senior fraud investigator for the National Bank that currently held the $600,000 lien on my parents' house. And sitting quietly near the window nursing a cup of black coffee was Special Agent David Vance from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. David and I went way back to my early days as a junior auditor before I left the agency to start my own private firm. "Thank you all for coming so early," I said, taking a seat and pulling out my thick red file folder. "I know we have been communicating in pieces over the last few days, but today we finalized the timeline. The trap closes tomorrow at 10 a.m. Marcus adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad. "Everything is ready on my end, Sasha. I have the purchase agreements drawn up and ready for your final signature. We just need to ensure the bank is fully prepared to execute the transfer of the distressed asset." I turned my attention to Elena, the bank investigator. Elena had been quietly looking into Preston and Talia's financial records ever since I initially flagged the forged loan application on Monday. Her findings had confirmed every single one of my worst suspicions. "The bank is completely on board," Elena said, her tone strictly professional. "We reviewed the original HELOC application alongside the certified tax documents you provided. The signatures of Thomas and Vivian are blatant amateur forgeries. We also traced the IP address used to initiate the electronic transfer of the $600,000. The funds were authorized from a laptop registered directly to Preston. The bank considers this a massive case of wire fraud and identity theft. We are ready to immediately offload the toxic debt to your LLC as discussed." I nodded, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction. When a homeowner completely stops paying their mortgage, the debt becomes what is known as a distressed asset. Banks absolutely hate carrying distressed assets on their books because it hurts their overall financial standing. So they often sell these bad loans to private investment firms for pennies on the dollar just to get rid of the liability. I had authorized my own private investment company to secretly buy the massive debt attached to my parents' home. The bank was thrilled to unload the fraudulent loan, and I was thrilled to gain absolute legal control over my family fate. "That brings us to the federal side of things," I said, turning to David. My former colleague set his coffee cup down and gave me a grim, knowing smile. "I have spent the last 3 days tracking the money trail," David said, opening a thick manila folder. "Your brother-in-law thinks he is a financial genius, but he leaves a digital footprint like a complete amateur. There is no technology startup, Sasha. There never was. He set up a fake corporate entity just to give the loan a legitimate-sounding destination. But the moment the $600,000 hit that account, he and your sister started bleeding it dry for personal use." He slid several printed bank statements across the table toward me. The transactions were absolutely nauseating to read. They had spent $70,000 at a luxury car dealership paying cash for Preston's new Tesla. There were dozens of massive charges to high-end designer boutiques in Beverly Hills covering Talia's sudden influx of Hermes bags and red-bottom shoes. But the most staggering losses were the wire transfers to various online gambling sites and luxury casinos in Las Vegas. Preston had literally gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars of his in-laws' stolen equity. They blew through the entire $600,000 in less than 10 months. David continued shaking his head in disgust. Not a single dime went toward a legitimate business expense. This goes way beyond simple bank fraud. By funneling stolen funds through a fake corporation, they have crossed into federal money laundering territory. The IRS is officially opening a criminal investigation. We have enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant for both of them, so we are all set. Then I asked, looking around the table at the three professionals who held the absolute destruction of my family in their hands. Marcus slid a heavy document across the mahogany table toward me. Just sign on the dotted line, Sasha. Once you sign this, your investment firm officially owns the debt on your parents' house. You will legally become their sole creditor. You will hold the absolute right to foreclose on the property and evict them. I picked up the black pen, feeling its solid weight in my hand. For 34 years, I had played the role of the dutiful, obedient daughter. I had quietly paid their bills, protected their reputations, and absorbed their constant insults. I had allowed them to treat me like a disposable safety net, while they worshipped a white con artist simply because he offered them the illusion of high society prestige. I thought about my parents kneeling on my porch, crying fake tears while actively trying to steal my home. I thought about Talia's manipulative videos turning my entire community against me. And I thought about Preston's arrogant face sitting in my office offering me a worthless 5% stake in his imaginary company. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a fluid, confident motion. It was done. We meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the downtown notary office, I said, closing the red file folder. My parents think they are coming to take my house. Let us show them what actually happens when you try to steal from an auditor. I walked out of the glass conference room and took the elevator down to the lobby of the bank building. The heavy red file folder in my briefcase felt like a solid block of concrete anchoring me to reality. For my entire life, I had allowed my family to dictate my worth. I had let my mother convince me that I was selfish for wanting my own financial security. I had let my father preach about family duty while he actively enabled my sister's toxic behavior. But sitting in that room with the lawyer, the bank investigator, and the federal agent, I had finally rewritten the entire power dynamic. The financial maneuver I had just executed was completely ruthless and entirely legal. It is a concept known in the corporate world as distressed debt investing. When a homeowner stops making payments on a massive loan, like the $600,000 home equity line of credit, my parents had taken out the bank views that loan as a toxic liability. It damages their quarterly earnings reports and ties up their capital. Banks do not want to be in the business of evicting people and managing empty properties. They just want to recoup whatever cash they can and remove the bad debt from their ledgers. Elena, the fraud investigator, had taken the evidence of Talia's forged signatures directly to the bank executives. Because the loan was now officially tied to federal wire fraud and identity theft, the bank was desperate to wash their hands of the entire mess before it became a public scandal. That is exactly where my private limited liability company stepped in. Through my corporate attorney Marcus, I offered the bank a clean, quiet exit strategy. I used my own liquid capital to buy the defaulted loan directly from the bank at a steep discount. I wired the funds from my corporate business account, and they gladly transferred the legal rights of the debt over to my firm. It was a brilliant financial assassin move. My parents and Preston thought they had outsmarted me. They thought their relentless emotional manipulation and the public smear campaign at the church had successfully broken my spirit. They honestly believed that a certified public accountant would just hand over $1 million piece of real estate because they cried on my front porch. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy celebrating their fake victory, I was quietly buying the very chains that bound them. By purchasing the debt, I did not just save the bank from a headache. I became the bank. I was now the sole legal creditor of my parents' house. I walked out of the revolving glass doors of the bank building and into the warm Atlanta morning. I got into my luxury SUV and merged onto the busy downtown streets. I did not drive back to my office right away. Instead, I found myself navigating the familiar route toward my childhood neighborhood. I wanted to see the house one more time before everything changed forever. The suburban streets were quiet and lined with manicured lawns. I pulled over across the street from the large colonial house where I had grown up. The house where I was always treated as the difficult child. I kept the engine running and stared at the heavy oak front door. The bright neon orange foreclosure notice was still taped firmly to the wood, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. I thought about the irony of the situation. For 96 consecutive months, I had quietly transferred $3,000 of my hard-earned money to keep that exact roof over their heads. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to protect my father's pristine reputation in the church community. And the moment I stopped being their silent financial savior, they had allowed a white con artist and their golden child daughter to steal $600,000 of equity right out from under them. Inside that house, right at this very moment, my mother was probably packing her expensive china into cardboard boxes. My father was probably organizing his suits. They were packing up their lives, fully expecting to move into my beautiful brand new home in Buckhead by tomorrow afternoon. They were probably discussing what color to paint my guest room for Talia's fake baby. They felt so incredibly entitled to my success that they did not even pause to question why I had surrendered so easily. My phone vibrated softly in the cup holder. I glanced down at the screen. It was an email notification from Marcus. The county clerk office had officially processed the paperwork. The assignment of the deed of trust was now complete and recorded in the public registry. My investment firm was officially listed as the sole lien holder on the property. Preston loved to use corporate buzzwords to make himself sound intelligent. He had stood in my office wearing his expensive tailored suit and tried to lecture me about capital and generational wealth. He had tried to mansplain basic economics to a woman who audited multi-million-dollar corporations for a living. He thought his unearned white privilege and his fake tech startup made him the smartest person in the room. He did not realize that true power is not loud or boastful. True power is having the silent liquid capital to buy your enemy's debt and hold their entire future in a single red file folder. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. The emotional ties to that house and the people inside it had been completely severed. I drove back to my quiet, pristine home in Buckhead, the house they felt so entitled to steal. I walked through my large chef kitchen, running my hand over the cool, imported marble island. The space was completely silent and perfectly peaceful. There was no toxic criticism. There was no gaslighting. There were no dramatic tears from a sister faking a pregnancy. There was just the solid, tangible proof of my own relentless hard work. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I reached past my everyday work clothes and pulled out a sharp, tailored crimson-red suit. It was the suit I wore when I needed to deliver difficult audits to hostile corporate boards. It was my armor. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we were all scheduled to meet at the luxury notary office. My family was expecting a surrender. They were expecting me to sign away my home and my future. I carefully pressed the crimson suit and set out my matching heels. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet and watched the sunset from my private balcony. The trap was fully constructed and the net was pulled incredibly tight. Tomorrow, I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to commit financial fraud against the woman who controls the ledger. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy downpour washing the Atlanta streets clean. I was sitting in my living room reading a novel when my phone lit up on the coffee table. It was a FaceTime incoming call from Talia. I almost ignored it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see exactly how arrogant they could be on the eve of their absolute destruction. I swiped the screen to accept the call and propped the phone against a stack of heavy books. Talia appeared on the screen, looking completely relaxed and incredibly smug. She was lounging on the couch in my parents' living room wearing expensive silk pajamas. There was absolutely no sign of her fake pregnancy belly, and she was casually sipping from a large glass of what looked exactly like real red wine. "Hello, sister," she chirped, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I am just sitting here looking at some high-end interior design websites, and I realize we really need to talk about the aesthetic of the Buckhead house before we move in next week." I did not say anything. I just watched her perform. "Your taste is just so incredibly sterile, Sasha," she continued, sighing dramatically as she scrolled on a tablet. "Everything is so minimal and rigid. It feels like a corporate lobby instead of a warm family home. Preston and I were talking, and we are going to have to completely gut the master suite." She held up her tablet to the camera, showing a blurry picture of an obscenely expensive modern sofa. "I just paid the deposit on this custom Italian leather sectional," she bragged, her eyes shining with greedy delight. "It is being imported directly from Milan. The designer said it usually takes 6 months, but Preston pulled some strings with his venture capitalist friends to get the shipping expedited." I listened to her casually admit to spending even more stolen money. She was ordering imported Italian furniture using the drained equity from our parents' home to decorate a house she was actively trying to steal from me. The sheer layers of financial fraud and entitlement were practically mind-boggling. Preston's voice suddenly echoed from the background of the call. "Tell her we are also tearing out that dark marble in the kitchen," he shouted, walking into the frame. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and holding a bottle of imported beer, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Preston leaned over Talia's shoulder and gave the camera a patronizing little wave. "No hard feelings, Sasha," he said, chuckling softly. "I know you are probably a little bitter about how things played out, but you have to understand that this is just how high-level asset management works. You made an emotional investment in a property, but we are making a strategic family investment. You should actually be thanking me for stepping in and restructuring the family portfolio. When my tech company goes public next year, you will be glad you secured that 5% equity stake," he continued, taking an arrogant sip of his beer. "We will invite you over for the holidays. You can sit on the new Italian sofa and see what real corporate success actually looks like." I looked at the two of them crammed together on the tiny screen. They were so deeply lost in their own narcissistic delusions that they could not even comprehend the massive danger they were in. They thought they had successfully outsmarted a federal tax auditor. They thought they had manipulated the system and won the ultimate prize without leaving a single trace. I did not feel angry anymore. I actually felt a profound sense of peace. Watching them gloat was exactly like watching two people enthusiastically arrange deck chairs on the Titanic. "My followers are going to be so obsessed with the house tour," Talia added, practically vibrating with excitement. "I am going to do a huge reveal video and talk about how Preston surprised me with $1 million estate for the new baby. You will not be in the video, obviously, because we want to keep the brand narrative focused entirely on our success story. It is all about synergistic branding," Sasha Preston explained, holding his beer bottle like a microphone. "You have to control the narrative. You played the role of the stubborn sister perfectly, but now you are playing the role of the generous donor. It is a very solid character arc for you." "Are you sure you do not want to keep the kitchen marble?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly mild and conversational. "It is imported directly from Greece." Talia rolled her eyes and took another deep sip of her wine. "Oh, please, Sasha, nobody uses dark marble anymore," she scoffed. "It is incredibly dated and depressing. We are going to replace it with a bright white quartz to maximize the natural lighting for my videos. And we are turning your home office into the nursery. I already ordered a custom luxury crib that matches the aesthetic of my social media brand. Mom and Dad are already packing up their stuff too," she casually mentioned, waving her manicured hand. "Mom bought a bunch of cardboard boxes, and they are sorting through all their old junk. We told them they can have the small guest room on the first floor since they cannot handle the stairs very well anymore. But they have to get rid of most of their old furniture because it will totally clash with the new Italian pieces." I absorbed that piece of information with a cold, clinical detachment. Even after my parents had sacrificed everything for her and actively participated in ruining me, Talia was still planning to shove them into a tiny guest room and throw away their lifelong belongings. There was absolutely no loyalty among thieves. They were perfectly happy to use my parents as human shields, and then toss them aside the exact moment they got what they wanted. I nodded slowly, looking right into the camera. "It sounds like you two have everything completely figured out," I said. "We absolutely do," Preston said, puffing out his chest and smiling broadly. "See, Sasha? This is what happens when you finally stop being so selfish and start listening to the visionaries in the family. Tomorrow is going to be a great day for all of us." I smiled directly into the camera. My smile was genuine and completely relaxed. "It absolutely is," I agreed. "Just make sure you both dress nicely tomorrow. It is a very important occasion, and there will be a lot of people there to witness it." Talia laughed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Do not worry about us," she said dismissively. "We always look perfect. Have the paperwork ready, Sasha. Do not be late." She ended the call abruptly. The screen went black, reflecting my own calm face back at me in the quiet room. I picked up my phone and set it gently on the wireless charger. I walked through my sterile corporate lobby of a house, deeply appreciating the quiet beauty of the dark marble countertops and the minimal aesthetic that I had paid for with my own hard-earned money. I walked into my master bedroom and checked my walk-in closet one last time. The crimson red suit was hanging perfectly pressed and ready for war. I thought about Special Agent David Vance sitting in his federal office finalizing the arrest warrants for wire fraud. I thought about Elena, the bank investigator, preparing the official foreclosure documents for my parents' house. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and climbed into my comfortable bed. While Talia and Preston were busy dreaming about imported Italian leather sofas and white quartz countertops, I fell into a deep, restful sleep, knowing exactly what the morning would bring. Friday morning arrived bright and perfectly clear. I drove downtown and parked my luxury SUV in the private underground garage of the high-end Buckhead law office that Preston had chosen for the signing. I walked into the sleek glass elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level. I was wearing my crimson red suit, the fabric perfectly tailored to project absolute authority and unapologetic power. When the elevator doors chimed open, I was greeted by the opulent sight of a sprawling reception area decorated with modern art and expensive leather furniture. I gave my name to the receptionist and she immediately escorted me back toward the large primary conference room. Through the heavy glass double doors, I could already see them. My family had certainly taken my advice to dress nicely. They were completely decked out in their absolute finest clothes, looking less like they were attending a legal signing and more like they were preparing for a high society photo shoot. My father was wearing a dark charcoal suit with a crisp silver tie, his posture completely rigid with self-importance. My mother was wearing a designer floral dress, her hair perfectly styled to project the image of a wealthy matriarch. Talia was wearing a tailored white maternity dress that highlighted her fake stomach to maximum effect, complete with expensive diamond studs in her ears. And standing at the head of the long mahogany table was Preston. He was wearing an immaculate light gray suit, laughing loudly, and already pouring champagne into crystal flutes that he had clearly requested from the law firm staff. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked into the room. The loud, confident chatter stopped immediately. They all turned to look at me, taking in the sharp crimson suit and the complete lack of defeat on my face. I did not look like a woman who was about to surrender her life savings. I looked like a corporate predator, walking into a cage full of very slow prey. "Ah, Sasha, you made it," Preston said, his fake smile returning instantly. He stepped forward, holding out a crystal flute of champagne. "Come on in. We were just celebrating the new chapter of our family legacy. It is a big day for all of us." I ignored the glass of champagne entirely and walked straight to the empty chair opposite him. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the floor and pulled out the thick red file folder, tossing it squarely onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Let us get straight to business," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. "I have a very busy schedule today, and I would like to conclude this transaction as quickly as possible." My mother clasped her hands together, beaming with greedy anticipation. Oh, Sasha, we are just so proud of you, she gushed, her toxic manipulation instantly returning to the surface. You are finally putting family first. God is going to bless you so much for this incredible sacrifice. I looked at her completely unfazed by her fake religious performance. I am not looking for blessings, Mom, I replied coldly. I am looking for a legally binding contract. Preston set his champagne flute down and adjusted his silk tie, trying to reassert his dominance over the meeting. He pulled a thin stack of papers from his leather portfolio and slid them across the table toward me. Here is the deed transfer agreement, he said, tapping the paper with his index finger. It is incredibly straightforward. You sign the property over to Talia and me, and we assume full legal ownership of the Buckhead estate effective immediately. I looked down at the pristine white paper. It was exactly what I expected. A standard quitclaim deed, transferring my $1 million asset entirely into their names. And the equity contract I asked, looking back up at him. The 5% stake in your technology company that you explicitly promised me in exchange for this property. Preston chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. Oh, right, the equity agreement. My lawyers are still finalizing the exact corporate verbiage on that document. You know how complex venture capital structuring can be. But do not worry, I will have it emailed to you by the end of the day. You have my word. Just go ahead and sign the deed transfer now so we can get the keys. He actually thought I was stupid enough to sign away my house based on a verbal promise from a proven con artist. He was sitting there dripping in my parents' stolen equity, casually trying to swindle me out of $1 million without even bothering to produce the fake equity contract he used as bait. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the edge of the mahogany table. I am an auditor, Preston, I said, speaking slowly and deliberately. I do not sign away $1 million assets based on verbal promises. And I certainly do not sign legally binding contracts without reviewing every single clause. I reached out and pulled the deed transfer document closer to me. Before I sign anything, let us review the specific clauses that you drafted in this agreement. I want to make sure we are all on the exact same page regarding the financial liabilities associated with this transfer. Preston sighed heavily, rolling his eyes and looking over at my parents as if to say, "Look how difficult she is being." "Sasha, it is a standard boilerplate template," he groaned. "There are no hidden clauses. You're just transferring the title. It is incredibly simple. Just sign the paper and we can all go celebrate." I ignored his complaining and flipped to the second page of the document, running my manicured finger down the dense legal text. "Here we go," I said, stopping at a specific paragraph near the bottom. Section 4, Paragraph B. Assumption of liabilities. I looked up, making direct eye contact with Preston. His smug smile faltered slightly. According to this clause that you drafted, the receiving party agrees to assume all associated financial liabilities and encumbrances currently tied to the transferring party and their immediate family. I read aloud, my voice echoing in the tense room. This is a very interesting legal phrasing, Preston. You are legally agreeing to take on all the financial debts of this family in exchange for this property. Yes, that is just standard legal protection, my father interjected, looking confused by my sudden focus on the fine print. It just means they are taking over the property taxes and the utility bills, Sasha. Stop trying to overcomplicate things and just sign the paper so we can go home. I looked at my father, feeling a sharp, twisted sense of pity for his absolute ignorance. "Oh, Dad," I said softly, "this clause covers a lot more than just property taxes." I picked up the thick red file folder from the center of the table and slowly untied the black string holding it closed. I pulled out a towering stack of heavily stamped legal documents and spread them out across the polished mahogany. These were not blank templates. These were official recorded county documents, bank ledgers, and federal investigation notices. Preston frowned, leaning forward to try and read the text on the upside-down pages. "What is all that?" he demanded, his confident tone suddenly slipping into nervous apprehension. I looked directly at Talia, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. The smug, arrogant smiles had completely vanished from the room, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. The trap was fully loaded, and the doors were officially locked. "These are the official records from the county clerk," I said, my voice steady and completely cold. I slid the first stack of heavy papers across the polished mahogany table directly toward Preston. "This is the home equity line of credit that was taken out against my parents' house exactly 14 months ago. The one for $600,000, the one that has not seen a single interest payment in over half a year." My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "We already discussed this, Sasha," he said, his tone annoyed. "That was seed money for the new business. Why are you bringing up old news when we are here to sign the new property transfer?" I did not look at my father. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Preston. "Because Preston here considers himself a high-level legal and financial expert," I explained calmly. "He drafted this deed transfer using a generic internet template because he is a lazy, arrogant amateur. And because he did not actually read the boilerplate text he left in Section 4, Paragraph B." Preston looked down at his own document, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his confident tech bro persona beginning to crack. I tapped the specific clause on the paper with my manicured finger. "The receiving party assumes all associated financial liabilities of the transferring party and their immediate family." I read aloud, making sure every single word echoed in the quiet room. "You put that generic clause in there hoping to shield yourself from any potential property taxes or hidden liens on my Buckhead estate. You were trying to insulate yourself from any financial fallout just in case I had secret debts. But you completely failed to realize what that clause actually means when you are dealing with a certified public accountant who knows exactly how to restructure toxic family debt." I reached into the thick red folder and pulled out the final document. It was printed on heavy legal paper with the official raised seal of the county registry stamped clearly at the top. I placed it directly on top of his amateur deed transfer, completely covering his worthless paperwork. "This is a distressed debt purchase agreement," I said, my voice cutting through the tense, silent room like a razor blade. "When a massive loan goes into default because the borrowers stop paying their interest, the bank considers it a toxic asset. They want to get rid of it as quickly and quietly as possible, especially when that specific loan is directly tied to federal wire fraud and forged signatures." Talia let out a sharp, gasping sound, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The color completely drained from her flawlessly contoured face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her hands completely abandoned her fake pregnancy belly to grip the edge of the heavy wooden table. "So I made the National Bank an offer they simply could not refuse." I continued, leaning back comfortably in my leather executive chair. "I used my private corporate investment firm to purchase the massive distressed debt that you illegally attached to my parents' home. I bought it directly from the bank yesterday morning for a fraction of its total value. The financial transaction was officially recorded by the county clerk at exactly 8 o'clock today." My mother looked frantically between me and the confusing legal paperwork, her mind clearly struggling to process the complex financial terminology. "What does that mean, Sasha?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What exactly did you do?" I looked directly at my parents, watching their confused faces slowly mirror the horrifying reality of their situation. "It means the bank does not own your house anymore, Mom," I said plainly. "My investment firm owns your debt. I am the sole legal creditor of your property." Preston pushed his chair back violently, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. "You cannot do that," he yelled, his face turning blotchy red with sudden panic. "That is completely illegal. You cannot just secretly buy someone else's mortgage." "It is called distressed debt investing, Preston," I replied smoothly, resting my hands on the table. "It is a highly regulated and entirely legal practice in the corporate financial sector. Perhaps if you had actually gone to a real business school, instead of just stealing my parents' equity to fund your fake luxury lifestyle, you would know how capital actually works." He stood there breathing heavily, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking, cowardly frame. He looked frantically at the paperwork, seeing my corporate seal stamped boldly across the transfer of the deed of trust. He realized in that exact agonizing moment that his entire pathetic scheme had been completely dismantled by the very woman he had been openly mocking just 12 hours ago on a video call. "So no, Preston," I said, picking up my pen and sliding his worthless quitclaim deed back across the mahogany table. "I am absolutely not signing my $1 million home over to you. I am not giving you my house. I am letting you know that I am the bank and I am foreclosing on yours." The absolute silence that followed was completely deafening. It was the kind of profound, heavy silence that only happens when an entire world collapses all at once. My father sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, staring at the heavy legal documents as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the debt purchase agreement closer to his face, putting on his reading glasses to stare at the bold black ink and the official government seals. My mother let out a low, whimpering sound, clutching the fabric of her expensive floral dress. "But we are your family," my father finally managed to whisper, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a pathetic, broken rasp. "You cannot evict your own parents from their home. You cannot put us out on the street." "You were perfectly willing to put me out on the street, Dad," I reminded him, my tone completely devoid of any pity or warmth. "You marched right into my professional office and demanded that I liquidate my life savings to cover the massive financial crimes of your golden child. You stood at the pulpit of your church and allowed your congregation to call me a greedy, selfish sinner. You made your final choice when you decided that covering up Preston's massive financial fraud was more important than protecting your own daughter." Talia suddenly burst into loud, hysterical tears, but this time there was absolutely no fake performance. There was no calculated emotional manipulation. These were the ugly, genuine tears of a spoiled golden child who had finally been backed into a corner she could not manipulate her way out of. She grabbed Preston's arm, shaking him frantically. "Do something, Preston!" she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. "Tell her she cannot do this. Call your lawyers. Call your venture capitalist friends. Fix this right now." Preston yanked his arm away from her, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated terror. "Shut up, Talia!" he hissed through his clenched teeth, glaring at his wife. "Just shut up, you are making it worse." I sat in my chair and calmly watched them turn on each other like trapped rats in a sinking ship. The beautiful, perfect family image they had fought so hard to maintain for 40 years was completely rotting right in front of my eyes. But the financial execution was only the first part of my master plan. I had legally taken their home and destroyed their fake wealth. Now it was time to let the authorities step in and take their freedom. Before the toxic silence in the room could fully settle, the heavy glass double doors of the conference room swung open with a loud, definitive thud. Everyone at the table turned their heads in unison. Walking through the doorway were not the law firm partners or the receptionist bringing more champagne. It was the alliance I had met with just 24 hours prior. Special Agent David Vance from the Internal Revenue Service walked in first, wearing a sharp, dark suit and carrying a completely neutral expression. Right behind him was Elena, the senior bank fraud investigator, accompanied by two uniformed federal officers, whose presence instantly sucked whatever remaining air was left in the room. Preston immediately dropped the deed transfer paper he was clutching and took a sudden step backward, bumping into his expensive leather chair. My father stood up, his face a mask of complete confusion and mounting terror. He looked at the uniformed officers and then looked at me silently, demanding an explanation for the sudden intrusion. But I did not say a single word. I just sat comfortably in my chair and watched the inevitable consequences of their actions finally catch up to them. Elena stepped forward and placed a thick stack of manila folders on the edge of the mahogany table. "My name is Elena, and I am the senior fraud investigator for the National Bank," she announced, her voice echoing with absolute institutional authority. "We are here today regarding a $600,000 home equity line of credit taken out against a property located in the suburbs of Atlanta. Our internal investigation has conclusively determined that the signatures on the binding legal documents were entirely forged. Furthermore, The electronic transfer of the funds was initiated under fraudulent pretenses, constituting a severe breach of federal banking regulations. My mother let out a sharp gasp, pressing both of her hands tightly against her chest. She looked frantically at Preston, expecting him to step forward and use his brilliant tech visionary vocabulary to explain away the misunderstanding. But Preston was completely silent. His jaw was clenched tight, and a visible bead of sweat rolled down his pale forehead. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant man who had strutted into my office earlier that week. Special Agent David Vance took a step forward and smoothly pulled his federal badge from his suit jacket, holding it up for everyone to see. "And my name is Special Agent David Vance with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a cold knife. "Preston and Talia, you are officially named as primary suspects in an ongoing federal investigation regarding wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Money laundering, wire fraud, identity theft. These were not minor family disagreements. These were massive federal felonies, carrying mandatory prison sentences. Talia let out a piercing shriek, grabbing her stomach and sinking down into her chair. She looked like she was about to pass out, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She looked frantically around the room, realizing that her fake tears would not work on federal agents. "This is completely ridiculous," Preston suddenly shouted, his voice cracking, as panic finally overtook his carefully curated corporate arrogance. "You cannot just burst in here and make these wild accusations. I am a respected entrepreneur. I am the chief executive officer of a technology startup. Those funds were legally allocated as seed capital for a legitimate business venture. We have a corporate structure. We have ledgers. This is just a massive misunderstanding regarding complex asset management." David did not even blink at the pathetic outburst. He simply opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "We have already subpoenaed and reviewed every single one of your corporate bank accounts, Preston," he stated, calmly reading from the document. "There is no technology startup. You registered a shell corporation and then systematically drained $600,000 to fund a lavish personal lifestyle. You wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore gambling sites and luxury casinos in Las Vegas. You purchased high-end vehicles and luxury designer goods using money obtained through forged signatures. That is the exact legal definition of federal money laundering." Preston physically recoiled as if he had just been punched in the stomach. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and frantic, searching for an exit that did not exist. His incredible white privilege, the very thing that had allowed him to effortlessly manipulate my parents for years, was absolutely useless against a federal agent holding hard financial evidence. He could not mansplain his way out of a federal indictment. My father slowly turned his head to look at Preston. The proud church elder looked completely shattered. His perfect white son-in-law, the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood, was being exposed as a common criminal in front of everyone. "All the money was gone," my father whispered, his voice shaking with absolute devastation. "You gambled away our entire home. You told us you were building an empire and you were just throwing it away in casinos." Preston ignored my father entirely. His chest was heaving, and he began pacing back and forth near the large glass windows. "I want my lawyer," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at David. "I am not saying another word to you people. You have no right to question me without my legal counsel present. This is a witch hunt. My wife is pregnant and you are traumatizing her. I demand that you leave this office immediately." "Talia is not pregnant," I said, breaking my silence and letting my voice carry clearly across the room. Everyone froze and looked at me. Talia stopped her hysterical sobbing and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She slowly lowered her hands from her stomach, completely forgetting to maintain the illusion. I pulled a single printed photograph from my briefcase and tossed it onto the table. It was a screenshot from Talia's own social media account, posted just 2 days ago, but quickly deleted. It showed her standing in a luxury boutique holding a glass of champagne with a completely flat stomach, wearing a tight designer dress. "She is wearing a prosthetic belly," I explained calmly, looking at the federal agents. She has been using a fake pregnancy to manipulate my parents into giving her my property and to generate sympathy online to cover up her financial crimes. One of the uniformed officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed loudly in the pristine law office. Preston backed away until his shoulders hit the glass wall, his confident corporate facade completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. He was hyperventilating, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, as the officer reached out and grabbed his arm, twisting it firmly behind his back. The federal intervention was swift and absolutely brutal. There was no negotiating. There were no corporate buzzwords left to hide behind. Just the cold, hard reality of the law finally catching up to a pair of arrogant thieves who thought they were untouchable. The reality of the steel handcuffs clicking into place finally broke whatever remaining spell had been cast over the room. Preston thrashed against the federal officer's grip, his expensive gray suit suddenly looking wrinkled and cheap. "This cannot be happening," he protested, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I am a visionary. I have investors waiting. You are ruining my company." I reached into my red folder and pulled out the thick stack of highlighted bank statements. I threw them across the mahogany table, scattering the papers directly in front of my devastated parents. "There are no investors, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly level. "There is no company. You do not even own the domain name for your imaginary startup." I looked at my father, who was trembling violently as he stared at the financial records. "Look at the highlighted lines, Dad," I instructed him. "Look at exactly where your $600,000 went." He slowly put on his reading glasses, his hands shaking so badly he could barely focus. He read the lines out loud, his voice a broken whisper. "The Bellagio Casino, $50,000. The Aria High Roller Room, $75,000. Beverly Hills Exotic Motors, $70,000. He looked up at Talia, his eyes filled with a horrific mixture of betrayal and absolute disgust. "You bought a luxury car and designer bags while you let us believe we were funding a technology empire?" he asked, his voice completely shattering. Talia immediately turned on her husband like a cornered wild animal. "It was all his idea," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Preston. "He told me the loan was a guaranteed success. He said we could borrow the money and pay it back before you ever found out. He forced me to trace your signatures." Preston stopped struggling and glared at her with pure venom. "You lying parasite," he spat back. "You were the one complaining about living in a small apartment. You were the one who wanted the shoes and the vacations and the influencer lifestyle. I lost the money trying to double it for us, but you just spent it on completely useless garbage." The illusion of the perfect white son-in-law and the flawless golden child violently exploded right there in the Buckhead law office. They were no longer the sophisticated power couple they had pretended to be. They were just two desperate, greedy criminals aggressively throwing each other under the bus to save their own skin. Talia lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the table. "Sasha, please, you have to tell them to stop!" she begged, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "I am your sister. We share the same blood. You cannot let them take me to federal prison." I stood up slowly, buttoning the jacket of my crimson-red suit. "I am not the one pressing charges, Talia," I explained coldly. "You committed wire fraud against a federally insured bank. You forged signatures on government-regulated financial documents. I did not call the police, the bank fraud investigator did. You did this entirely to yourself." The second federal officer stepped forward and pulled out another pair of handcuffs. Talia screamed a high, piercing sound of absolute terror as the officer grabbed her wrists. My mother completely collapsed, sliding out of her chair and onto the expensive hardwood floor. She was wailing loudly, mourning the sudden brutal death of her perfect family image. Preston was dragged out of the conference room, first kicking and screaming about calling his lawyers. Talia followed closely behind him, sobbing hysterically and begging our parents to do something. But Thomas and Vivian just sat there, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Once the federal agents cleared the room, the heavy glass doors swung shut, leaving just me and my parents in the sudden, deafening silence. I gathered my legal documents and placed them neatly back into the thick red folder. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was never quite good enough. They looked incredibly small and broken. All of their arrogant entitlement had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the devastating reality of their own foolish choices. "What are we supposed to do now?" my father whispered, staring blankly at the scattered bank statements on the table. "Where are we supposed to go, Sasha?" I picked up my leather briefcase and looked him dead in the eye. "That is entirely your problem, Dad," I replied. "But you cannot go back to the house. As the new legal owner of the property, I have already finalized the eviction paperwork. The county sheriff is scheduled to arrive at your address at 3 o'clock this afternoon to change all the locks. You have exactly 4 hours to pack whatever you can fit into your sedan and leave." My mother looked up from the floor, her face red and swollen from crying. "You are throwing us out on the street," she sobbed. "How can you be so cruel to your own parents?" "I am not being cruel, Mom," I said, walking toward the glass doors. "I am simply restructuring my financial assets, just like Preston advised." I pushed the doors open and walked out of the law office, never looking back. The drive back to Buckhead was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. The heavy, humid air of Atlanta felt different now. It felt completely clear. I arrived at my beautiful $947,000 home. I walked into the kitchen, running my hand over the dark imported marble countertops that Talia had so desperately wanted to destroy. I poured myself a large glass of Cabernet and walked out onto my private balcony. For 34 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations. I had allowed them to gaslight me, manipulate me, and drain my financial resources simply because we shared the same bloodline. But standing there looking out over the quiet, serene neighborhood, I finally understood the absolute truth about family. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to abuse you. Shared genetics do not entitle anyone to your hard-earned success. The greatest and most terrifying step toward true freedom is realizing that you have the absolute power to cut the anchor before it drags you down to the bottom of the ocean. My parents lost everything because they chose the illusion of prestige over the reality of loyalty. Talia and Preston lost their freedom because their greed entirely blinded them to the consequences of their actions. And I gained my entire life back because I finally stopped playing the victim and decided to become the architect of my own justice. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and completely cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace and success? I would absolutely love to hear your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that setting boundaries is not selfish, it is essential for survival. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your worth is never defined by the people who refuse to see your value.